Wow. Fun, huh?
It's amazing how much you can get done in 10 years.
Well, I'm just really, really excited, first of all, to be welcoming all these folks to an event in St. Paul, but welcoming these two amazing visionaries, both of whom I know and admire so much. Rhiana Gunn-Wright, people might know, she gets dubbed as the lead architect of the Green New Deal, which is sort of a big lift, but I know she's toiling away to put together the Green New Deal, and people might know she's a Rhodes Scholar, which I think is a nice start in life, and she worked for First Lady Michelle Obama, which is not also a bad gig, and she was at the Detroit Health Department and the Women's Policy Research. So I got to know Rhiana through Twitter, and Twitter is a remarkable way to get barriers broken down, and I just was always amazed at her thought leadership and her humility and how she can see the opportunities for energy to transform communities and to make the world a better place. So I've just really, really admired you and your public presence. We're so glad that you're here. Talk about the connection in between energy and equity, and something that really, as you can see from the video, is at the center of the discussions at Fresh Energy and on all the discussions on energy and climate policy.
Yeah, and I think some kudos should go to Michael for believing in me, even though my Twitter picture has a dog filter. He never questioned my intelligence for a moment.
I did wonder about your Twitter photo. And Jigar Shah has a pretty good Twitter photo too, and was one of the great leaders in this movement. He's a co-founder of Generate Capital, and it's an investment firm that operating platform that builds and owns and operates and finances assets, infrastructure asset. He's an expert in making the connection between the transition to clean energy and building prosperity. Jigar coined the phrase that solving the climate problem is the greatest wealth creating opportunity in human history. So Jigar has been on a stage with Fresh Energy more than once. I think this is maybe the third gig. In fact, he came and spoke at a solar event while we were trying to build support for now Speaker Hortman's solar energy bill in 2013. I think we passed 5 bills that year on solar policy. And Jigar told me that if Minnesotans were willing to accept a 1% increase in their electric bills, we could have had our solar energy standard by 2023 instead of 2030. So right at that time, we had almost no solar industry in Minnesota. I think there was a total of 12 megawatts. And now, 5 years later, there's over $1 billion of investment in solar energy in our state. So Jigar's key sites are, the important role of attracting capital and helping shape the clean energy. So these are different points of view, but this conversation we're hosting, I hope it raises up the obvious point, is that both of you have such great life experience, but you both share the same passionate vision about the world and the same future that we're trying to create together. So both of you are committed to truly a transformative change, and I just deeply appreciate that you have different perspectives and you want the same things that I do. So let's just dive right into the questions, and I have to admit, I shared the questions with them in advance so they wouldn't be caught off guard, but I did have 3 surprise questions they haven't heard, and they don't know which are which. So, in the past couple of weeks, over 4 million people around the world have taken to the streets, and young people, especially in 150 countries, are protesting, and they're just raising up the obvious concern of urgency that the actions don't match up with the problem. And how did each of you, in your own way, communicate the urgency, the seriousness of the climate change problem, and the need for action at the scale of the problem and the speed of the problem? How do each of you talk about that and communicate that in your work?
Yeah, I can start. I realized there was a time maybe 10 years ago where you wake up one morning and you're like, I'm no longer young, right? When you're doing this work and you're working so hard, you're like, I'm still young, I'm still relevant. And then suddenly you take a survey and they're like, what age group are you? And they're like, you're in the other thing. They're like, they're not marketing to me anymore, right? I recognize fully that that the energy from this movement is coming from these young people, right? And that's wonderful. It's not something that I think that I have a lot to, advise them on or help them through or whatever else. It's more, me on the learning side. I'd say on the other side, it's really about, having bold sort of, conviction around what is possible, right? I think for a long time, 40 years actually, we've been fine with incremental progress on, making building codes slightly tighter, making cafe standards slightly better, figuring out how we actually do this thing better. And I think what the young people are telling me right now is, hey, get on with it. Like, we've been piloting it for 40 years. Like, just do it now, right? And that's inspirational.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm really excited to be here. My last gig was, I was a policy director for a gubernatorial campaign in Michigan. And on good days, I was like, Michigan could beat Minnesota. And then on bad days, I was like, I'm going to Minnesota. I don't know this They already tax wealth correctly. So I think the question that you ask is, actually, I address it in two separate ways. Getting people to understand the urgency of climate change, I think, comes down to removing, as much as we all like to say, science, and that's true, the fact is that most people experience climate change through three things: the weather they live in, right? Economic impacts, if their homes flood, or if they're on fire, what happens after that? And then health effects. So usually that's what I'm talking to people about to understand the urgency. So one thing that I talk about all the time is what the climate will change in your area. So like, I live in DC. By 2080, Maryland will have the climate of Mississippi if we don't take any action, right? Minneapolis will have the weather of Kansas, right? You're talking about winters that are 16 degrees warmer. And 40% wetter, right? And talking about it like that gets people thinking, because when you say you live in Maryland, now you live in Mississippi 50 years later, all of a sudden, when do kids go outside to play when it's 100 degrees out in summer, right? Do you have air conditioning? What about heat islands? All of that, all of a sudden people start going, oh, I would have to change my life. And then as far as like scale and speed and scope, again, we're talking about young people, their fears. We talk a lot about their courage, but their courage is coming from a place of fear, right? I just talked to a 20-year-old at Yale, and she probably has better prospects, and she told me three things. One, she was pretty sure she was gonna graduate into recession. Two, she and her friends weren't sure if they should get 401ks because they didn't even know if they would live till 50. And three, she's already talking to her boyfriend about whether or not it's ethical for them to have children. Mm-hmm. And especially what if their life expectancy is 20 years, right? Is it still ethical to bring a child into this world? And so urgency, scale, and speed, if you have 20-year-olds thinking that, something is wrong. And that's where I sort of start with people, because climate is a deeply emotional issue, even though we constantly talk about it in terms of technical questions.
I'm so glad that she's actually the spokesperson for this thing and not me. Good. We failed so miserably in 2008 to actually make this a thing, right? We spent millions of dollars on all of the studies for the Apollo Alliance and this thing and that thing, and we could not communicate to people in 08, right? And I'm just so grateful that you're figuring out how to communicate to people today.
So Jigar, tell us why public policy is a critical actor in driving this transformation. I do have people say if capital markets are so efficient, if the costs are falling so fast, if these technologies are so much better, why do we need public policy? Why is there sweeping and transformative public policy have to catalyze the change we need? Why?
Oh, so excited.
Well, I say this to a lot of people. I work in infrastructure, right? Which is basically the thing that no one wants to think about, right? They're they want to think about the new movies that come out. They want to think about the new food trends in their city. Nobody wants to think about how their sewer gets taken care of, or their garbage, or electricity, or water, whatnot. And ultimately, all of that by definition is policy, right? I mean, from the very beginning, right, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, everyone basically outsourced this stuff to corporations, authorities, others, such that politicians are no longer experts in general in infrastructure. And when someone says, if you pass that law, we're gonna have rolling blackouts, you're like, oh, I don't want rolling blackouts, right? But they're not experts themselves, so like if the CEO of XYZ company says you're gonna have rolling blackouts, like, well, maybe I should listen to that, right? So I think that's one piece of it, but the second piece of it is to suggest for a moment that someone who's actually done something the same way for almost 100 years is going to change the way they're doing things because of capitalism is ridiculous, right? And so when you think about where wind and solar are today, they're there because we passed renewable portfolio standards throughout the country, right? I mean, we were, at the time ambitious, and we were like, we were going to be at 20% by 2023 or 2025 or whatever it was. And but that's why the first power purchase agreements were signed. Even today, I would suggest that these power purchase agreements are not getting signed because wind or solar is cheaper. It's because there's some perception on the part of the utility companies that if they don't do it, they are going to get regulated to do it. So one way or the other, right? They better do it to show leadership. And so, like, I'm a big believer in capitalism. I just think that the notion that infrastructure gets done without public policy and that capitalism itself works as just think is foolish and isn't borne out in the data.
Or the idea that markets make themselves.
Right.
Right.
Rhiana, I know a lot of people are asking the question and seeing how these various social movements that are going on in the world, how they're overlapping, and that climate change is connected to so many different kinds of social movements. But I also know a lot of people are concerned or confused about that because they think, oh, the climate problem is so enormous, why do we have to deal with these other issues too at the same time?
Right.
So a lot of folks who work in the movement talk about this as intersectionality. I just want you to explain this, like, why does this matter so much?
Yeah, so it matters so much for a couple of things. The first is that climate is enormous, but that means that climate shapes the background of every issue, right? Like we're not talking about immigration in abstract, right? There is no thinking about immigration policy without thinking about the fact that there will be millions of climate refugees, right? And that you're talking about probably a scale of internal migration that we haven't seen in decades, right? As climate changes and as sea levels rise, right? And so that's just one issue, right? Climate also exacerbates health issues, right? So there is no thinking about healthcare without thinking about what kind of healthcare do you need in a warming society, right, on a warming planet. And so I think that sort of understanding that all of these issues, the ground on which they are fought changes dramatically when you think about climate is reaching various movements, and they're realizing that unless they get in front of it, right, the immigration policy that they are passing in the midst or fighting for in the midst of climate refugees coming could be different, right? Their strategies could be different. So there's an understanding among movements. But the other thing is that I think people are understanding that a lot of these issues, whether it is democracy reform or climate change or health, have common roots largely in systems of oppression, in colonialism, in racism, in misogyny, right? I talk about this when it comes to climate change, right? Part of the warming is warming is coming from burning fossil fuels. We have burned fossil fuels at the rates that we have in part because there are pockets of society that you can poison, right, without much worry about punishment, right? That is the reason you can have peaker plants, right? That is the reason that you can run a pipeline, right, under Straits of Mackinac, say, in Michigan, and threaten people's lives, right? That area is not a big city. It's not a big moneymaker, right? And so as long as there are pockets of people without the same rights as other people, it's going to be very difficult to close down loopholes that allow the burning of fossil fuels, right? Just think about the Dakota Access Pipeline. That was routed through Bismarck. Bismarck is 93% white. They got that rerouted without much, fight, and it got rerouted through federal, tribal land. But it got rerouted through tribal land and violated like 50, 60 federal treaties, right? But that's because we say indigenous people count less, right? So all of that is connected, the ways that we exploit land, all of that. And I think particularly movements are seeing that, and younger folks are also much more likely to be, I've seen, looking from a systems view, and therefore much more likely to be having intersectional movements. So you have Greenpeace throwing down with the immigration group in Texas over a detention facility. And then that immigration group then came out and supported the climate strikes. So they are working across boundaries too, because they recognize that a lot of their fights are connected. Similarly, the fight for climate legislation would be very different if we didn't have voter suppression, right? Or the Electoral College. Right? If all of our votes counted equally, what kind of fight would we be having about whether or not we should be having clean energy? It's a lot easier to move people who are getting poisoned than it is people who are making money from that poisoning.
So everyone here, the reason they're here is they understand how steep this hill is that we have to climb, or how deep these reductions have to get and how fast they have to get deep. I mean, this is, if you really know the data, it's really kind of alarming. People use the word alarmist. I like to have a t-shirt that says alarmist because I'm alarmed. How do you keep hope alive? How do you, is there any example in human history where we've had the change at the pace and the boldness and the urgency that we actually need this next decade? What example in human history is there of change that fast? Did either of you have a thought on that?
Go for it. I've heard you answer this before.
The New Deal! And World War II mobilization. But in fact, I like to go to the New Deal. One, because it was pretty speedy, considering the scope of the problems that they were dealing with, but also because it was speedy in part because quickly the government became a space for experimentation, right? It became a space where institutions changed to address problems. Dozens, if not, I think it might be hundreds of programs were created in the New Deal. And you're talking about new institutions, new programs for work, new ways for agencies to work together, new funding vehicles, right? And that was because they recognized the problems that they were facing and said, we have to change our institutions to face these problems, right? We don't serve these institutions. And I think that's the tension that we have now. Every day, basically, someone goes, well, we can't have climate action because of politics. And these are people that don't necessarily actually think we'll succeed. So it's not Pollyanna, it'll just get better. But it always strikes me as really wild because in that moment, I'm like, you are counting the Earth, which is 5-0 in the extinction game. She has not been beat. And versus Mitch McConnell, right? We are actually treating Mitch McConnell and the filibuster, all these things, as forces of nature, right? Institutions as forces of nature, the filibuster as a force of nature, right? When we are actually facing forces of nature, which again, have been very successful. We are not T-Rexes. They didn't make it, And
My son is 4 years old and is really into dinosaurs. And he constantly is quoting me these dinosaurs are not alive anymore. They were all wiped out at 75 million years ago. And so he even believes in mass extinctions already.
Yeah.
What gives you hope and optimism, Jigar? Why do you have hope and optimism?
Well, I'm, the other side of what Rhiana's doing, right? In general, I think that what I'm hoping for is that the work that I do leads to solutions that politicians actually believe are ready to be scaled up, right? That you can't scale something up when it comes out of a lab. You have to scale something up when it's already a $100 million industry or a $1 billion industry, and then you need to make it 100 billion, right, or a trillion. And so, I just think that there's just such a lack of confidence in America's ability to do big things. And that's what's shocking to me, right, with the Mitch McConnell thing, is that we just think so little of ourselves today, right? When you think about what Stephen Strong did in Massachusetts in the 70s, creating net zero homes back then, right? It is not hard to create net zero homes. California is mandating them next year, and they will all be about 1% more expensive than a regular home. Literally nothing. Yeah. And that 1% is going to be funded at 3.5% interest rates for 30 years. And so it's just
a good deal.
It's the dumbest thing ever. Why would you sit around and say, I would love to pay through the nose for natural gas and electricity and water and all these other things, because I'm not smart enough to actually join a collective that forces everyone to do it more intelligently, right? And it just literally makes no sense to me. Even transportation, right? We are so obsessed in this country on stupid things, like, for instance, widening roads. Right? There's been data.
Stop
right.
doing that.
Right? But like for 25 years, every single researcher has said when you widen roads, more people decide to drive, less people decide to drive together. And then we create an HOV lane because we're like, we need to widen the road to create an HOV lane. And you're like, oh, wow, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And then when you go to Asia, for instance, they just ban car traffic. Right? So they basically say this 2 square mile area downtown will no longer allow cars. Guess what happens? Cafe traffic way up, bicycle traffic way up, right? Economic sort of development or economic activity in that central business district goes up 50%.
Small business.
Right? So you get way more tax revenue, all those things that people want. And it's one of those things where part of what bothers me the most is just in your video, you guys talk about the New Flyer buses. I worked for the Clean Cities program at the Department of Energy in '97. In '97, we had Chattanooga switch to all electric buses, right? Downtown Chattanooga. We had all sorts of case studies that showed that people didn't want to eat outside of cafes because it smelled like diesel fumes. Oh, as soon as we went to electric buses, everyone wanted to eat outside and cafe traffic was way up, right? We have case studies from '97 on this. Right? I respect the work you're doing, but I just think that we have such low expectations for ourselves and what we can handle and what we can do, and that is just sad.
I agree. Okay, well, people like to call it the lightning round, so these questions are going to be quick, and the answers are going to be short. And I'm going to ask 2 or 3 of them, boom, 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 so one sentence answers. So there's the first one. What are the 3 bedrock big things that have to be in sweeping federal action on climate and energy? What are bedrock 3 things that absolutely must be in the bill, must be part of the solution when we do big things? What 3 things have to be there? 1, 2, 3.
Workforce training and retraining with an emphasis on matching particularly fossil fuel workers with commensurate jobs, jobs with similar wages and benefits. I actually think buildings are such, like Jigar said, such an easy emissions target, and we're doing so poorly there. And I think the last thing, and this is because I'm a real nerd about service delivery, I believe that actually building programs that work and that are designed around how people will use them is a key way to make them popular and durable. So I actually think really taking a look and thinking about new models of partnership and cooperation between states and federal, I think it's actually super crucial.
3 things, Jigar, have to be there.
Well, first let me just say that this is Gandhi's 150th birthday, so really want to try to channel some of that here. I don't think cities are going to work. And so I think there's going to have to be a rethink of the way in which we want to live. My sense is that the notion that everyone wants to live on top of each other, Hong Kong style, I think is going to be really difficult. And I think modern ways in which people situate themselves is going to be something we're going to have to think through, right? We haven't thought about that since the suburbs of the 1940s. The second is, I think, figuring out how to pay farmers to be part of the solution. We'll have to be part of that, so sequestration. And the third part of it for me is trash, right? I just, like, the thing that I find weird is that Sweden imports trash because they're so good at processing it, right? And we can't seem to get out of our way. We're like, we need to bury more of it. And I don't understand it. Like, we know how to, do better with trash.
Okay. So here's the last question. What's one big thing that Fresh Energy should do and what Minnesota should do to help lead the nation? What's the one biggest thing that Minnesota could do or should do? It's an easy one. Should I just give you the answer? We should pass the 100% bill that Governor Walz has proposed and get Excel to help him pass it. That's what we should do.
That's what you should do. You should support the 100% bill and get Excel to help pass it. Also, for us, it would be helpful if you could also say how much faster you could go with federal funding and how much more you could do.
That's good.
If you had additional support.
Last word from either of you?
One thing I want to make sure that everyone recognizes is that we hear a lot about individual action these days, and Lord knows it's inspiring, and so I want people to keep doing it. But buying a Tesla and getting solar on your roof and figuring out how to make your home energy efficient doesn't really solve anything. And I just think it's important for all of you to know that, like, you haven't checked the box when you've just bought 3 new things for your home, right? You check the box when you actually work to make sure that the right people get elected, that you're actually participating in whatever board you care about, the water planning board or this board or that board or whatever it is that you care deeply about. You got to get involved, right? Because when you get involved and people hear from you, that's when we start moving things forward, people get more hopeful, and people are in the mood to actually pass big legislation.
Oh, yes. Go Jigar. I wasn't doing a great job of this, but anyway. I would say don't be afraid to talk about climate with people that you know from an emotional place. I think because climate has been sort of maligned as either a hoax or tree huggers or whatever, there's a real emphasis on intellectualizing. What does the science say? What does the UN say? What does the IPCC report say? And all of that's really important, but the fact is that when you're talking about climate particularly, you're talking about people's fears. You're talking about the ways people are thinking about living their lives in the future, about their futures. And just like, I find that if we can start from that place, you can actually move people a lot further than if you're just talking to them about parts per million and warming. Because again, this is like a deeply human problem. We are grappling with, can we face a huge crisis in time, and can we figure out how to care about one another enough and see that lived out in legislation and the ways that we are planning really the next phase of our society. This is, if you wanted to be alive during a big shift, this is it. Right? This is it. And so, like Jigar said, involving yourself, but also just being honest about what you're afraid about too, so that people can talk to you about what they're afraid about and you can help them figure out a way forward as well as yourself, because community is going to be, I think, the thing that gets us all through this.
So, Rhiana and Jigar, I just want to thank you both for so generously sharing your time. We didn't compensate or provide stipends. We just covered your expenses to get here. And I mean, everyone can see your wisdom and how deeply and passionately you care about these issues and explore these issues. But I also want to acknowledge how warm and loving you both are and how you brought that to the stage. This is a very, very hard time that America is in. It can't imagine it could be harder, but it's also an incredibly exciting moment in human history. And like you just said, if you want to be alive in an exciting time, now is a good choice. So we're all inspired by both of you, and we deeply appreciate your being here.
Well, we're inspired by you, Michael.
We have one more little video treat. We can sit here and you can both see the video. the message from a different perspective, and then we'll hear from our final speakers. So one more little video here.